Welcome. I'm going to use notes today because I don't want to muddle other people's words or introductions, but please know that I'm so pleased to be here with each of you today. I'm Monica Mohindra. I'm the director of the Veterans History Project here at the Library of Congress, and of all days, it makes so much sense that we are here today. What you can't see behind all this lovely apparatus is the Supreme Court is just there, so take a minute before you leave to peek out the blinds, and the Capitol is just there. But more importantly, this is the Library of Congress, which is our nation's oldest federal cultural institution. It began as a law library with just 700 books and 3 maps, and big aspirations to house our nation's reason, memory, and imagination. And today, we are here witnessing the realization of that. With over 160 million items, it is a remarkable place and workforce, which sustains and preserves a universal collection of knowledge and creativity for now and for future generations. History and memory are a crucial dyad here, and particularly today. The Veterans History Project is honored to join with you today and to welcome you to the Library of Congress. Congress created the project in 2000. The idea was to give veterans a platform, a place to have and preserve their first-person memories, their personal experiences about their time in uniform, about their service, and for us, so that we, through their individual stories, could connect with our collective and national history. In addition, I hope you all saw, in addition to the voices you may have seen today during the display and that you'll hear more about as the afternoon progresses, the project is our collective repository of our veterans' first-person experiences, and now over 119,000 of those voices strong and growing because of people like you. Their voices are resounding and informing also because of people like you. Our collections range from a rare journal of World War I to the first-person accounts of the women and men who served in recent conflicts, such as Iraq and Afghanistan. Just one such veteran in our collections, Mr. Benjamin Cooper, was among the first American troops to enter the concentration camp Dachau. A Jewish veteran, in discussing the importance of relating veteran stories, he gave examples of the benefits personally and globally. He said, and here I really need to read my notes. He said, and it bothered me. It just like festered there all the time, and I couldn't talk to anybody about it. There was no one to talk to, you know? That's why I didn't talk for 45 years. I still have the little pictures of Dachau. When I came home and I showed them to some people, oh, you know, you couldn't grasp it, and I couldn't talk about it, you know? But now I do. Now I want people to know it happened. There was a Holocaust. He began sharing his story after meeting survivor and author Henny Simon and speaking to students and the public because she encouraged him to do so. They shared a message against hate, and they proliferated through their Connecticut community his term for what they were doing, sharing a message of no act of kindness, no matter how small, is ever wasted. Of himself, reflecting on the benefits of this experience of coming back to himself by sharing his story, he said, and I was revived. But back to here, and now, together in this place, these collections of narratives, some amongst us, of lived experience, do not just sit on dusty shelves under the eaves. What is the point of collecting them if we don't do something with them? You are the essential element in this equation. By gathering and sharing these important stories, these memories shape our collective reason and give wing to imagination, so that together we create a brighter future. Thank you. I'd like to now introduce, it's my great pleasure to introduce Shanita Jones, the Senior Operations Manager for the Office of Human Capital Services within the Veterans Benefit Administration. Ms. Jones began her VBA career in 2015 when she joined the Appeals Management Center. Following years of distinguished service, in April 2021, she was hand-selected to be one of 4 managers for the Inclusion, Diversity, Equity, and Access Task Force, IDEA. A month later, Ms. Jones joined the Office of Policy and Oversight, OPO, where she served as a Senior Management and Program Analyst co-leading OPO's front office division. Ms. Jones, Shanita, is a 2016 graduate of VBA's Performance Analysis and Integrity Inaugural Mentorship Program and has since received several awards, numerous awards. Her previous work includes with the Social Security Administration and the Voluntary Service of the Veterans Health Administration, both in North Carolina, and several years in the private sector. Ms. Jones has a BA in sociology and an MA in organizational and strategic communications. She is an active member of Delta Sigma Theta sorority and a Veteran Affairs IDEA influencer. In addition, Ms. Jones is a proud United States Army veteran who honorably served her country in Afghanistan. Thank you, Ms. Jones. Thank you all.
Good afternoon. As has been stated, my name is Shanita Jones, and I am a Senior Operations Manager with the Veterans Benefits Administration, Human Capital Services. And I am privileged to lead this ceremony today on behalf of the United States Department of Veterans Affairs. Thank you, Ms. Mohendra, for those moving opening remarks and for making us feel so welcome here today in this hallowed space. We are so fortunate to be with you all in this beautiful building. The Library of Congress is one of our nation's most valued treasures. For those of you who are joining us online today, please plan to visit this stunning building. I really cannot put into words how ornate, impressive, and special this room is where we gather today for this somber occasion. And before we start with our program, we in VA are grateful for our partnership with the Library of Congress and to those here today for your dedication and your hard work on the Veterans History Project and to the Jewish War Veterans of the United States. We would also like to thank our VA Secretary, Dennis McDonough, Deputy Secretary Tanya Bratcher, Undersecretary for Benefits, Joshua Jacobs, and Undersecretary for Memorial Affairs, Matthew Quinn, for attending today's ceremony. Please join me in welcoming our first speaker, Rabbi Chesky Tenenbaum. Rabbi Tenenbaum is a dedicated spiritual leader and chaplain. He is a staff chaplain at the VA Maryland Healthcare System. Rabbi Tenenbaum is also the founder and the director of the Jewish Uniformed Service Association of Maryland Chabad, an organization dedicated to supporting service members, veterans, and first responders. Good afternoon, Rabbi. We look forward to your invocation.
Thank you. Father in heaven, creator of all life. In your hands is the soul of every living thing and the breath of all creations. Almighty God, we are gathered here today to commemorate the Jewish American veterans for their contribution to our nation and the memory of the 6 million Jewish souls who perished during the Holocaust. We are here not only to weep, even though our hearts and minds are full of horrors committed against the 6 million holy and beloved souls. We are also here to honor them and to proclaim the everlasting sanctity of their being. Grant us the courage, O Lord, as we reflect that over 70 years have passed since the end of the Holocaust, so we may strengthen our hearts and take into our hearts the purity and righteousness of the millions of innocent people whose lives were cut short. Our country was founded on the basic principles of liberty and justice for all. It is thanks to our brave men and women of our armed forces, both here and overseas, that we continue to enjoy those God-given rights and freedoms. Master of the world, please guard our military who support and defend this great nation and its values of truth and loyalty. We pray for your guidance as we affirm our sacred duty as their descendants. We are here not only to reflect upon the lost generations, but to actively honor their memory by emulating their actions and the values they practiced every day. May it be your will, God of mercy, that you grant us the strength and vigor so that we can add light to darkness. Let me share my personal family connection to the horrors of the Holocaust. My dear grandfather, Rabbi Mendel Tettenbaum, a Polish Jewish refugee who in 1939 had fled to Vilna, Lithuania, to escape the Nazi occupation. However, as the Nazis closed in on Vilna, my grandfather found himself in a desperate situation. That's when he heard about Mr. Shiune Sugihara, the Japanese consul in Vilna, who was issuing transit visas to Jewish refugees. Mr. Sugihara, who had been posted in Vilna in 1939, was aware of the dire situation by the Jewish population. Sugihara was deeply moved by the plight of the refugees and decided to take action. Without permission from his superiors, Sugihara began issuing transit visas to Jewish refugees, including my grandfather. Over the course of several weeks, in 1940, Mr. Sugihara issued thousands of visas to Jewish refugees, many of whom were able to escape to safety. The visa issued by Mr. Sugihara enabled my grandfather to escape the Nazi occupation and ultimately find safety in the United States. My grandfather, one of 8 siblings, was the only member of his family to survive the Holocaust. After relocating to New York on May 29, 1945, just a few weeks after the end of World War II, he married my grandmother, Devorah. Together they raised 5 children, one of whom is my beloved father, and welcomed over 35 grandchildren. Today, his legacy is carried on by more than 120 descendants. He served as an educator and principal at the local yeshiva in New York City, imparting knowledge to thousands of students. I was fortunate to have grown up just a few blocks from my grandparents. Sadly, only 4 days after celebrating my bar mitzvah, my grandfather suffered a major stroke, which he never recovered. He passed away in the winter of 1994 at the age of 76. My grandfather's story serves as a testament to the power of courage and compassion in the face of overwhelming adversity. He was able to escape the horrors of the Holocaust and start anew. I would like to end with a prayer for world peace, especially in Israel and the Middle East, as is written in the book of Job. I'll read in the original Hebrew text and then translate. Oseh shalom bimromav, hu ya'aseh shalom aleinu, v'al kol Yisrael v'imru, amen. He who makes peace on high may bring peace upon us and upon all of humanity, and let us say, Amen.
Thank you, Rabbi. It is now my pleasure to introduce the Honorable Joshua Jacobs, Department of Veterans Affairs Undersecretary for Benefits. Before being nominated by the President to serve as Undersecretary for Benefits, he served as the VA Secretary's Senior Advisor for Policy and at VA in 2 other positions, and spent nearly a decade working in the United States Senate. Undersecretary Jacobs believes passionately it is essential veterans, their families, caregivers, and survivors are provided access to benefits quickly, accurately, equitably, and with a world-class customer experience. Please join me in welcoming the 8th Undersecretary for Benefits, Joshua Jacobs.
Well, thank you very much for that kind introduction, and thank you all for joining us here today. I want to begin by thanking Monica and the entire Library of Congress team for opening their doors to us for this really incredible event, and for their commitment to preserving the history and the memories of America's veterans for future generations as well as today through the Veterans History Project. I also want to acknowledge some of the special guests that are here with us today: Secretary McDonough, Deputy Secretary Bradsher, Undersecretary of Memorial Affairs Matt Quinn, as well as many other VA senior leaders. We have Congressman Derek Van Orden, a number of White House and interagency partners. We have Jewish War Veterans National Commander Barry Lashinsky and Executive Director Ken Greenberg, many other Jewish War veteran members and VSO leaders as well, and especially to our speakers, my wife's favorite professor from her time at Vassar, Professor Deborah Dash Moore, as well as Medal of Honor recipient Jack Jacobs. I also would like to take a moment to honor the recent passing of Rabbi Lowell Cronick, who served as chaplain and associate national director of the VA National Chaplain Center with special responsibilities for education and Jewish affairs. Rabbi Cronick truly cared for his fellow human beings from all walks of life, and he is sorely missed. We're here to commemorate Jewish American Heritage Month and to celebrate the contributions, the experiences, and the sacrifices of Jewish American veterans, who since the American Revolution have stood valiantly in defense of the freedoms that we hold most dear. Yet as we celebrate, we also must remember. Today marks Yom HaShoah, a day of solemn remembrance for the millions who were murdered during the Holocaust. It's a day to honor the memory of those who perished, to bear witness to their suffering, and to reaffirm our commitment to stand up to anti-Semitism and all other forms of hatred and bigotry. In that spirit, I'd like to share a story of a Jewish veteran who you can learn more about in the room behind us, Major Milton Stern, a Jewish officer in the U.S. Army Air Corps during World War II. And like many men at that time, Milton felt the pull to serve the nation. So he left a lucrative job to enlist in the Army Air Corps. And when he found out he was going to be stationed in Alaska, far away from the fighting, he tried out for the aviation cadet program and was accepted, ultimately becoming a navigator. On March 8, 1944, during his second flight over Berlin, one of the engines on his B-17G plane was shot. He and his airmen had to fly lower to evade German detection while hoping to make it safely to a place to land. And when Milton and the bombardier suddenly realized they were flying over German Air Force field, they hopped on the plane's 2-gun turret and began shooting at anything they could, ultimately destroying 6 or 7 aircraft while leaving a path of destruction. Unfortunately, some of the surviving German planes quickly took up the chase, and just as they thought they were on the path of safety, their other engine was shot out and they had to jump. Luckily, Milton was found by a young Dutchman who helped him into the Dutch-Paris line, a resistance network that helped Jewish families and downed Allied aviators by hiding them or taking them to neutral countries. For 3 months, he made his way across Europe by bike, trolley, train, and rowboat, hiding in different rooms, in haystacks, and even a castle. But his luck would run out on the morning of May 27th when he woke up to see a gun pointed at his face by a member of the Gestapo. He and the family hiding him were brought to a Nazi prison camp. Milton was put into solitary confinement. And a month and a half later, on his 21st birthday, Milton was forced to witness the execution of 14 of his Belgian friends. And shortly after that execution, he was told, "You're next, unless you tell me what I need to know." But Milton said nothing. And after saying nothing, he was joined with other American service members who were put into boxcars and sent to a German interrogation center. After enduring 6 months of interrogation, the Germans ultimately segregated more than 200 Jewish officers to send them to a concentration camp, where death was certain. But thanks to a Russian offensive that began only 2 days later, their departure was prevented, and ultimately, they were liberated 6 months later. Milton spent the rest of his life caring for the wounds of war of his fellow veterans, serving as an active volunteer at the Lions VA Medical Center in New Jersey, with the Jewish war veterans, the Air Force Association, and the American Ex-Prisoners of War, until he passed away in 2007. Milton's story reminds me of the power of hope to sustain us through difficult times. But more important than hope is the power of our collective action. So I look forward to recommitting ourselves to the noble mission of serving our nation's veterans with the compassion, the dignity, and the unwavering dedication they deserve and have earned, even in difficult times. And these are difficult times. There is a harsh reality that we face today. Anti-Semitism is on the rise, both here in America and abroad. Social media has reinvigorated Holocaust denialism and anti-Semitism through the spreading of misinformation, lies, and hate. Hate that leads to extremism and violence. And the Holocaust is a reminder of how fragile the freedom that we cherish truly is. It's a reminder of what can happen when we turn a blind eye to the gradual, methodical erosion of rights and dignity, and when the voices of hatred go unchallenged. Through our celebration of Jewish American Heritage Month, and by recognizing the contributions of Jewish veterans, we wield a powerful weapon against hate. By shining a light on their stories of hope, resilience, and bravery, and by honoring their sacrifices on the battlefield, like the inspiring stories of Major Stern and the remarks you'll hear shortly from Medal of Honor recipient Jack Jacobs, and those whose stories will be preserved today in the Veterans History Project, like that of Julia Cardozo's father, Lieutenant Michael Cardozo. No one understands the importance of honoring legacies through the power of storytelling more than Professor Deborah Dash Moore, whom you'll hear from this afternoon. Her 2004 book, G.I. Jews, How World War II Changed a Generation, follows the lives of 15 young Jewish men as they served in the military while trying to make sense of its demands and also wrestling with what it meant to be both an American and a Jew, fighting anti-Semitism on 3 fronts. So as we listen to these stories, I'm reminded of the recent celebration of Passover. Through the story of Passover, we witness the Israelites' oppression and the power of their hope for freedom. Their journey from bondage to liberation resonates deeply for me during Yom HaShoah, and it shows us how hope can sustain us during difficult times. But even more important than hope is our commitment to ensure that horrors like those that happened in World War II never happen again. Our commitment to honor the legacies and inspire future generations to unite and stand against intolerance. Loud voices are trying to normalize the venom of anti-Semitism, but we will never allow it to become normal. That's why the President developed the first ever U.S. national strategy to counter anti-Semitism, and it's why we're working with our interagency partners to drive home the importance of countering all forms of hatred so we can shape a more inclusive and diverse and compassionate society. Across VA, we're focused on combating anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and all other forms of religious bias. We're committed to ensuring that every veteran, family member, caregiver, and survivor receives equitable access to the benefits, care, and services that they've earned. And we're committed to capturing the stories of Jewish veterans and all veterans through the Veterans Legacy Memorial, led by Undersecretary Quinn and the team at VA's National Cemetery Administration. I'm proud to be a part of an organization that advances an inclusive environment, one that supports diversity, and one that stands against hatred and prejudice. I want to thank all of you for coming today, to join us, to remember, to mourn the lives of those tragically stolen in the Holocaust, and to celebrate the sacrifice and service of Jewish veterans, which is as important today as it was 80 years ago. Before I close, I want to reaffirm our commitment to learning about history, to never forgetting what happened, and to rejecting all forms of anti-Semitism, racism, hatred, and prejudice. Through this act of remembrance, we will educate future generations to never remain silent in the face of hatred. It's our job, it's our responsibility, both individually and collectively, to ensure atrocities like the Holocaust are never erased and never happen again. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Undersecretary Jacobs. We appreciate your perspective and look forward to hearing more from you in a few minutes during your fireside chat with our next speaker, Professor Deborah Dash Moore. Please welcome Professor Deborah Dash Moore, the Frederick G.L. Hootwell Professor of History and Professor of Judaic Studies at the University of Michigan, where she specializes in 20th century urban Jewish history. She is the author of multiple books, articles, and collections, including G.I. Jews, How World War II Changed Your Generation, which was made into a documentary film. She also received the Saul Vernier Prize for Best Book in American Jewish History, in addition to many other awards and honors. Welcome, Professor Dash Moore.
It's a real honor to be here, and thank you for that lovely introduction. I want to take you back in time to the middle of the 20th century, a little bit before that middle, to 1939, which was when World War II began. The United States didn't enter the war, right, for another 2 years. But it starts in September 1, 1939, with the invasion of Poland by Nazi Germany. And American Jews particularly watched what was happening overseas. It's an odd position to be in, to be watching what's happening and not necessarily being able to do that much, right? Because the United States was neutral. There was aid that was sent, of course, but there wasn't yet involvement. Not until the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, right, in December of '41. And then American Jews, like so many other Americans, could rush to enlist. Now, American Jews were eager to fight Nazi Germany even more than they were eager to fight the Japanese, because Nazi Germany was an enemy not just for Jews, but also now for Americans. And it was an opportunity then for them to bring together these two aspects of their identity by fighting a shared enemy. Most American Jews in those years lived in a handful of big cities. New York, of course, also Chicago, Philadelphia. And that meant that most Americans never met any Jews because they weren't spread out around the country. They were concentrated. 40% of American Jews lived in New York City. And even within New York City, they lived in certain neighborhoods. They knew other New Yorkers, of course, but not many Americans. So when the war comes to the United States and it mobilizes Americans of all types, Jews suddenly meet all these other Americans. And these other Americans also meet Jews, which is not to say that these other Americans don't have ideas about Jews. Right? In interviews that I did for the book, right, there are soldiers who talk about having their head rubbed, right, by fellow GIs because, you know, where were the horns? They heard Jews had horns. Right? There were other kinds of anti-Semitic stereotypes that were shared by fellow GIs that the Jewish GIs recognized were really dangerous because they were supposed to go into this together, right? All of them. They had to feel that they didn't have to worry about their back, right? That their back was protected. So if there were notions about Jews as cowardly, that was really important for them to overcome that. I'll give you an example from a guy who is in the infantry named Paul Steinfeld. And he was actually from DC. And they're training in a camp in Pennsylvania. And this guy next to him, they're shaving, he says to him, Steiny, that was his nickname. Everybody had nicknames back then. I don't know if they still have nicknames, maybe we'll find out. But everybody had nicknames. Steiny, he says, what are you doing here in the infantry? I thought all of your race was in the Quartermaster's Corps. Now, I'm sure everybody here knows about the Quartermaster's Corps, right? That's for supplies. And that's not in the front lines. And Steinfeld is furious. So he drops the razor, and he's ready to fight. And he says, what kind of a stupid question is that? Here I am, standing right next to you. We're both in the infantry, right? And what do you mean about calling us a race? And the other GI steps back and he says, you know, I didn't mean it. I've never met a Jew before. And I just thought, you know, Jews are a race and they're in the Quartermaster Corps. So Steinfeld decides, no, he's not going to fight. He's going to try to educate his fellow GI, which indeed he does. But this task of educating fellow GIs is something that is constant because Jewish experiences were in fact different. Let's just take masculinity, which is an important piece of those years when the military was mostly men. They did have, you know, women's Army Corps and the waves and stuff like that. But basically men. Masculinity. What does it mean to be a man? Well, if you're a New York Jew, being a man involved sports, doing well in sports and aggressively. You play baseball or softball aggressively. You play basketball aggressively. When a Jewish GI, and another one that I interviewed, he gets down to basic training in Mississippi. They have a softball game going, and he's playing the way, he played in the Bronx. And everybody's saying, what's the matter with you? Why are you doing that? And he gets criticized for being so aggressive, because for many of these other soldiers, masculinity was tied up with driving a car, for example. Jews didn't drive cars in New York City. No need to drive a car in New York or Chicago or other big cities. You used public transportation. They also couldn't afford that. So there were these different ideas, competing ideas of what it meant to be a man, what it meant to be a Jewish American. The army, the military, also had its own views as to what it meant to be Jewish. And they called Jews in those years Hebrews. So you had a choice, when you got your dog tag, of having a P for Protestant, a C for Catholic, or an H for Hebrew, or nothing, of course, on your dog tag. And most Jews took the H. It was a way of identifying as a Jew, but it came along with military recognition of the equality of Judaism. Judaism becomes, in World War II, one of the three fighting faiths of democracy, along with Protestantism, along with Catholicism. Now, Jews, unlike African Americans, are integrated into the units. Right? So they're not segregated, and therefore this kind of recognition is really important. And I will mention just one or two instances of it. In World War II, they built chapels, for example, and one of the things about those chapels was that they didn't have crosses on them. They could be used by any of the three religious groups that were recognized at the time. That was a very important decision that was made. Did this mean that everybody respected Jews? No, but the fact that the military did was really crucial. And when you had ceremonies of, especially at cemeteries, when the dead are buried, you usually had both a Protestant minister, a Catholic chaplain, and a Jewish chaplain all represented. So that kind of equality was really valuable. And it gets epitomized in the incident of the Dorchester, which goes down in the North Atlantic. It's attacked by German submarines. And with over 700 men on board. And there were 4 chaplains on that ship, a Jewish chaplain, Catholic chaplain, and 2 Protestant chaplains, one evangelical and one liturgical. And they're, since they're officers, of course, they're on the upper decks. And they decide to give up their life vests and other gear to the men who are coming up from below as the ship is going down. And then they go down with the ship together. And it's a very powerful moment because they each speak the prayers in their own language, right? So the Protestants speak in English, the Catholic speaks in Latin, and the Jew speaks in Hebrew. So that sort of symbolizes, what the military is trying to do at this point in time. Josh mentioned how Jews are fighting a threefold enemy. The enemy of Nazi Germany, the enemy of Nazi Germany as Jews, not just as Americans, and then the enemy of anti-Semitism within the ranks themselves. When Jews, as part of the military, get to the, in 45, get to liberate some camps, the reactions they have are extraordinarily diverse. But since Dachau was mentioned before, I will just sort of end with an account from Dachau. So Dachau is liberated in May, right near the end of the European conflict. And later in May, a chaplain named Eichhorn comes, and he wants to hold a service for the Jewish survivors. Now, Dachau is a camp that held a wide array of different types of prisoners, and Jews and Roma, gypsies, were at the very bottom of a rank hierarchy. And he's going to hold this service, and he wants to do it in the open area of the camp, the sort of most public area. And he's told, no, he can't. There's been an objection. He needs to hold it in the laundry room. So when George Stevens, who was a colonel, maybe he turned colonel, I don't remember exactly, hears this. Now, Stevens was a Hollywood filmmaker. He hears this, and he's furious, right? What's going on? So he goes and he complains, and the U.S. military steps in. And they say, no, Jews, you can have your service in the main camp, even though the other Dachau prisoners are objecting. Not only that, but we're going to film it. So if you go to Signal Corps Records, you can see a filmed version of the Dachau service. It's a powerful and very moving service because Stevens was a really adept filmmaker. So you don't just hear what the chaplain, the rabbi, says when he says the Shehecheyanu prayer, which is the prayer thanking God for having brought us alive to this point in time, but he lets you see the responses of the survivors, some of whom are intently watching and some of whom are in tears. And I think that, as the chaplain said at that moment, he came to them as a member of the U.S. military, but also as a representative of the American Jewish community. It was that moment of coming together in those two identities that occurred in World War II that's so important. And it's great to be able to celebrate and remember how that happened for us today here. So thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Let's invite Undersecretary Jacobs back up to join for the fireside chat. Come on up, Mr. Jacobs.
All right. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate that. You mentioned in the 30s and 40s, American society was often hostile and suspicious of American Jews, and that many, if not most, had not met someone who was Jewish. And similarly, many Jews grew up in very insular environments, even if they had friends outside of those communities. And so I'm wondering, if you can expand on, how Jewish service members navigated this kind of uncertainty, having to prove themselves both individually, but also to their new colleagues and fellow service members.
Well, it really depended upon who the person was and where they came from. And sometimes the struggles were out in the open, as the Steinfeld example, but sometimes they were also internal. One of the people whose correspondence I looked at, and they wrote letters back in those days, which is really wonderful in terms of resources, and you have some of them outside here, which is great. Arthur Gorin writes home to his parents. He has enlisted. He's 18, and they haven't even started basic training. He's in New Jersey in the camp. And he writes home and he says, the bugle blew and your son, got up and immediately didn't have his uniform yet, but he marched off to the mess hall, right? And there was your typical American breakfast. There was cereal and milk and coffee, right? And orange juice and eggs with ham. And Goran, had never eaten out, right? He ate at home, and his mother had a kosher home. And he never really thought about that. And so he's looking at the ham, and he's trying to figure out, well, what do I do? Do I eat it, or do I not eat it? And he decides, well, it's a long time to lunch, and we're going to have a lot of things that we're going to have to do. And so he starts to eat the ham and eggs, but he washes it down with the coffee, and he writes to his parents, I ate it the way you would an aspirin, just sort of forcing himself. But now, what's going on here is really so interesting, because none of the other recruits sitting around that table would have had any idea that he was struggling to eat the ham and eggs. And that is sort of symbolic of the way in which he was internalizing his Jewishness. Right? Some things now, you don't say. Right? And I think that's one way in which people coped. Yeah.
It's a good segue into a point you made in your book, is that there was incredible diversity, notwithstanding that I think about half of Jewish service members were from New York City.
Right.
That there was still significant diversity, religious, non-religious, rich, poor, urban, rural. And so I'm curious, many of these service members are coming in very aware of the differences between them and their fellow service members, but they're also going through a very similar emotions. They're trying to get ready, they're training, preparing for the unknown of going to war. And so I'm curious how they navigated those similarities and the differences.
So I think that, I mentioned about the H. Everybody got an H, irrespective of whether you were, Orthodox or Reform or secular or, an atheist. You had an H, which was a way of dealing with Jewish diversity. Yeah. But some of the people who came from small towns, I have one of the guys I talk about in the book is Ira Koplow, who comes from Sioux City, Iowa. So in Sioux City, he knows what it's like to be a minority. And in a sense, he's much more familiar with how to deal with the non-Jews in his unit than the Jews coming out of New York, who have more problems with it. In addition, I hate to say this as somebody who comes from New York, but New Yorkers were not thought of very highly by other Jews. They were seen as, too pushy and too, some of the more negative attributes. So there was that kind of tension as well that existed.
Yeah, one of the points that I took away from your book is serving in the military taught a number of the Jewish service members and veterans to stand up for themselves.
Yes.
And war changes everyone. That is certainly true of Jewish veterans, like it was for the rest of the broader population. I'm interested, when they come home from war, many of them become active in fighting for social justice and trying to address kind of what they perceive to be wrongs within our country. Can you talk about how military service changed Jewish veterans and what that did to them when they came home?
Sure. So in order to understand the change, you have to keep in mind what Jews just accepted as normal. They accepted as normal prior to the war. There were neighborhoods they couldn't live in. There were jobs that they couldn't get because they were Jews. There were schools they couldn't attend because they were Jews, right? There was a whole list of things that this was normal, right? You had to figure out how to navigate around them. When these veterans come back, it's like, no, I fought for this country. I don't want to be told that I can't rent an apartment in this neighborhood, or I can't buy a house with my GI mortgage in this section of, you know, of a city or whatever. I want to be able to apply for schools, you know, for colleges and universities and medical school and stuff, and not be told that, no, there's a quota and you can't get in. So there was a sense that they weren't going to take what they had previously accepted, and they had learned how to fight. The military taught them how to fight, and they knew how to do it. So when they wanted to try to desegregate places, they often put on their military uniforms, right, and would go around, right, to say, how come you're not renting, right, to Jews and stuff like that. It really marked a big change, and it happens very quickly. 1945, 46, you start to see, you know, Jewish organizations and Jews active in saying, we have to make a different America. We have to make a better America.
Yeah. You know, it's often said that war has a way of making even the most committed atheists religious. But for many who fought in World War II, the exposure to the horrors of the war and the liberation of the concentration camps made them question or even renounce their faith. Can you talk a little bit about how military service and these experiences impacted Jewish veterans?
So that's a very big and hard question, because the way in which it had an impact varied enormously, okay? So Jews who actually went into the camps among the first, you know, what they don't talk about particularly is that the first thing that you noticed as you approached a concentration camp was the smell, right? It was the smell of death and of burned bodies and stuff like that. And as they're getting closer, you know, they come into camps like this. I mean, one guy, for example, whom I quote, named Dressler, he goes into, I believe it was Ohrdruf, you know, this is not a military target, right? And you see these prisoners, and you're trying to figure out how to understand it. But many of the units that go in early don't stay. They immediately leave because, in fact, it's not a military target. And so it's the troops that are further behind the lines that come in and then have to deal with it. So it's like repeated encounters. And some of the GIs reflect upon the fact that they felt a real solidarity with their fellow Americans, because their fellow Americans were really disgusted and furious and about what they saw, and that was a feeling of inclusion. They didn't feel separated out. Others, you know, don't understand how does you know, how do you live in a world where man does this to man? Where is God? They ask. So I think there's really a very diverse range. One of the people I write about comes to Mauthausen, which was a slave labor camp, and he writes about it. He's brought there because he's going to write about it for Stars and Stripes. And he's actually in the Pacific Theater, but Eisenhower wants everybody to know, even if you're in the Pacific Theater, about what's going on in Europe. And he writes a letter home to his parents. And he was from a very assimilated Jewish household. And he says, I want every year at Yom Kippur, which is, you know, on the high holidays, the Day of Atonement, to read this letter that I'm writing. You should take it out and read it, because we can't forget. And what I saw there. So that's an extraordinary kind of reaction, right, from someone who had come from a very assimilated background.
Yeah. Thank you. You mentioned the Dorchester, and your book talks about the role of Jewish chaplains and providing interfaith counseling and spiritual support. I'm curious if you can talk about how that was received across their fellow chaplains, across the broader military, and really how the presence of Jewish chaplains and then the specific example of the Dorchester and the 4 chaplains who famously sacrificed their lives changed perception among some about Judaism and Jews in general, and just the importance or the kind of relevance of interfaith collaboration.
Yeah. So again, that's a really good question. The military in their training for chaplains, they had a month-long or so training, tried hard to build connections across divisions. So even how the chaplains roomed, they put them, Jewish with a Protestant with a Catholic, right? They're rooming together while they're getting this training, so that they're learning to respect each other and to come to understand each other, because they're going to have to minister to men of all faiths and no faiths, as they say. How are they received? It varies. It really does. I mean, one of the very famous accounts is that of Roland Gittleson, who's a Marine Corps chaplain. And he's at Iwo Jima. And he's asked by the chief of chaplains there to give the eulogy when they dedicate the Marine cemetery. And I'm sure you're all aware this was a really hard battle. There were many lives that were lost. And Gilson's ready to write this. And then the Catholic chaplains, the padres, object. No, they don't want a Jew praying over the graves of what are mostly non-Jewish men. And so they have 3 separate ceremonies, right? There's a Catholic one and a Protestant one and a Jewish one. And Gittleson uses the same speech for the Jewish one as he had prepared. And one of the Protestant chaplains comes, and they preserve that speech. And actually now, if you go online, the Marine, I'm not sure, I don't remember exactly, but you can look it up. The Marine Corps has the whole speech and the account, and it's a very moving one. And he talks about, these men, among them, there's no difference between rich and poor, between black and white, between Protestant and Catholic and Jew, right? They lie in the purest democracy. And if we the living, don't make fulfill what they died for, if we don't make that living democracy, right, then we will have betrayed our brothers who are lying here. It's very powerful, very
Great.
powerful. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Great way to end.
Thank you, Undersecretary Jacobs and Professor Moore, for the engaging and informative discussion. Now, please join me in welcoming Colonel Barry Leshinsky. Barry Leshinsky is a retired colonel whose military service spans over a total of 34 years. He continues to be committed to our military veterans. He currently serves as the National Commander of the Jewish War Veterans of America. He joins us today to introduce the Medal of Honor recipient, Jack Jacobs. Welcome, Colonel Leshinsky.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary McDonough, Deputy Secretary Ms. Bradshaw, Undersecretary Josh Jacobs, Undersecretary Quinn, the Library of Congress staff, veterans, families, caregivers, and survivors. Thank you very much for having JWV participate in this incredible evening. But I'd like to recognize one other individual, and he's our National Executive Director, Ken Greenberg. Ken was able to pull this together and to get JWV involved. So Ken, I want to say thank you. You know, what you may not know is Jewish war veterans have been around since 1896. We just celebrated our 128th anniversary in Lexington Avenue, where the first muster began for Jewish war veterans. And we went back to the site on the 15th of March, and we held a muster of our own members there. And after that meeting, we went down to Central Synagogue, which happened to be 2 blocks away from where the Jewish war veterans met that first night on March 15th, 1896. Central Synagogue was there at 1872. So the first time we went back was this past March, and we're trying to see if there's a lineage that maybe some of our members were part of that synagogue. And what we have here today is we're talking about lineage. We're talking about stories that our service members brought. And we need to remember them. We need to document them. And we need to continue to tell, just like General Eisenhower did during World War II. We need to document what happened. We need to talk about the facts, and we must never, never forget. And when I talk about never forget, if you have a chance, go down to our national headquarters, and better than that, it's in the same building of the National Museum of American Jewish Military History. Take a tour through there, because that's our legacy. And what talks about our legacy is what's our credentials. Our credentials are the men and women and families that served in all wars since the Revolutionary time. So if you're around DuPont Circle, I'll give you Ken Greenberg's phone number, because Ken will be glad and be honored to set up a tour for everybody to go through. So with that said, what I'd like to do is talk about the individual that I'm going to bring forward. Is another colonel from the United States Army, Mr. Jack Jacobs. He was born in Brooklyn, New York, holds a bachelor's and master's degree from Rutgers University, and entered the United States Army in 1966 as a second lieutenant through an ROTC program. He served as a platoon leader in the 82nd Airborne Division, an executive officer of the Infantry Battalion in the 7th Infantry Division, commanding the 4th Battalion, 10th Infantry in Panama. A member of the faculty of the United States Military Academy, Mr. Jacobs has taught international relations and comparative politics and is a member of the faculty of the National War College in Washington, D.C. He was in Vietnam twice, not once, twice, and both times as an advisor to the Vietnamese Infantry Battalion, earned 3 Bronze Stars, 2 Silver Stars, and the Medal of Honor, the nation's highest combat decoration. Mr. Jacobs retired as a colonel. He's also a senior fellow in the Department of Social Science in the U.S. Military Academy and a distinguished visiting professor in Rutgers, and serves on several of charitable organizations. Now, what Mr. Jacobs does not know, what I'm about to do, is I wanted to know a little bit more about Mr. Jacobs, because if I was going to introduce him, it was important to me to have an understanding. So I happened to read his book. If you get a chance, you need to read the book. And not only do you need to read the book, but you have to recycle the book. And when I say recycle the book, you need to pass it on to somebody that you can teach, coach, and mentor along. And you'll understand what he did to receive the Medal of Honor. And Mr. Jacobs, I'd like to leave you with one thought that I can say personally. For the individuals such as Mr. Jacobs, that's Colonel Jacobs, that served in Vietnam, who happen to be here today, and those that served in Korea, and those that served in World War II, thank you for making my life in the military a little easier, because you came back with the lessons learned from combat, and you were able to train my generation. So at this point in time, what I'd like to do is welcome Medal of Honor recipient, Mr. Jacobs.
Thanks. Thank you. I'm very chagrined to realize that when you all stand up, you're taller than I am. Well, very disconcerting. I'm looking at this picture. This photograph was taken last Thursday. Well, I'm delighted to be here. Although at my age, I'm delighted to be just about any place. I am a New York guy, even though I live in New Jersey now. I joined the military for a couple of reasons. The first was I was at Rutgers University, and I got married when I was 18 years old. Do not do that. And needed the money, and they paid you, in ROTC, the second 2 years, they paid you $27 a month, which wasn't even a lot of money back in those days, but that's the first reason. The second was I thought then, and I still think today, that everybody who's lucky enough to live in a free country owes it something in the form of service. And the third reason was my father, who served in the Second World War. He had been studying electrical engineering at the University of Minnesota, and about 8 weeks from graduation was dragooned unceremoniously into the Army and fought in New Guinea and the Philippines in the South Pacific. Hated getting dragged out of school, hated the Army, hated getting shot at, nobody likes that very much, and got out of the Army the instant that he could when the war was over. And yet when he got to be my age, all he would talk about was how proud he was at having saved the world. And his generation had done that and motivated me to go do my bit. His family were Greek Jews who were brought from Judea 1,600 years ago as Roman slaves to Greece, where they spent the next millennium and a half. And when the world started to fall apart before this First World War, realized that as bad as things were for everybody, they're going to be much worse for the Jews, and they left. They left and they came to one of the very few places in the world that would take them. That's the United States. So they got here about 120 years ago. My father spoke nothing but Greek until he went to school. And then wound up in the Army. And this motivated to do what I thought I should do, and that is to put on the uniform myself. My objective was to stay in the Army for 3 years. That was my obligation, and then get out and do something useless like become a lawyer or something. I apologize to all you lawyers. The room's probably filled with them. Well, I've got a son who's a lawyer. He's a very nice boy. You better take care of me, too, is all I got to say. But I stayed. I stayed beyond the 3 years because I really loved the people, and I didn't want to leave them. And today, when people ask me, what do I miss most about the Army, I tell them it's the people. I always feel better when I'm around people who are either in uniform or have been in uniform, and I still don't want to leave them, which is why I hang around military people all the time. I went through ROTC, and then between your junior and senior year, you wind up going to ROTC summer camp, which is basic training for college students. And I remember our drill sergeant was a drill instructor, was a guy who and even today reminds me of nobody so much as the drill instructor in Full Metal Jacket, that guy. So the first Sunday we're there, he says, okay, all the Catholics line up here, and all the Protestants line up here, and they marched off to go to church. That left the Jews in the platoon. Each of us received a toothbrush and then had to go to the latrine to clean the toilets. Well, we tried to determine who came back first. It was the Catholics, actually, who were evidently more efficient at delivering the Word of God. And so the following Sunday, all the Protestants line up there, and all the Catholics line up there. And until he died, I'm sure that drill sergeant had no idea what happened to all the Jews. True story. Those of you who've spent some time in the crucible of combat know that there's no way that you can convey what it's like to anybody who has not been in combat. And the whole idea of identifying people who've done extraordinarily well in difficult circumstances is a subjective evaluation at best. I remember somebody once asked Bob Kerrey, Medal of Honor recipient from Vietnam, lost his leg, was a Navy SEAL, became governor of Nebraska, and then was a senator from Nebraska for a while. Somebody once asked him in an interview, what does it take to receive the Medal of Honor? He says, well, you have to do something. People have to see it. They have to be able to write, and they can't hate you. Those are the 4 requirements. So you think about all the people who served in combat and performed valiantly, and nobody saw it. Or people saw it, and they were killed, and there was nobody left to witness it. Or what happened from time to time, and with annoying frequency, actually, people did see it, they did write it up, and either accidentally or on purpose, the witness statements were conveniently lost. And that all reminds me, or should remind all of us, what Medal of Honor recipients will say when asked to recount what they did and all. We won't talk about it. Not because it's difficult, but because there were other people who were brave that day, because there were people who did not come back. And as one recipient recently said when he was interviewed, he said, I don't wear this medal for me, I wear it for all those who can't. And another recipient, Woody Williams, who, until he died a couple of years ago, was the oldest, on Iwo Jima, he was a young kid, received the Medal of Honor, I think he was 19 years old or so at the time. He said, this medal is not mine, I just hold it in trust. We should all feel that way, all of us who've said that uniform that we wore, that we wear, is an item of trust, and we should never forget it. I'm reminded of a very good friend of mine, gone for some years now, named Tibor Rubin, Ted Rubin. Ted Rubin's was the only ceremony other than my own I attended. When he heard that he was going to get decorated, he called me up and asked me if I would come, and I said I would. Ted was 15 years old in Mauthausen concentration camp. and he was liberated by the 11th Armored Cavalry Regiment, part of the Patton's Third Army. And just because you were liberated didn't guarantee anything. As you heard, the Army would liberate it and they'd keep going because they had a lot of work to do. And whether or not you survived was largely a function of whether or not you had any energy left. Ted did survive, and he made a commitment to himself that if he did survive, he would find some way to come to the United States to become, as he called it, a G.I. Joe. And in 1948, he did exactly that. Well, he came to the United States. He was trying to get into the Army, but he only spoke Yiddish and Hungarian, and he couldn't pass the test. I'm recounting to you what Ted told me himself, and there's little doubt that it's not true because I heard it from other people, too, from his family. So he hooked up with a couple of kids who had been drafted to go fight in the Korean War. And they said, look, you're an idiot if you want to go into the Army. This is very bad news indeed. He said, no, I got it. I have to do it. I made a commitment to myself that I would pay the United States back for saving my life. They said, well, you're not going to pass the qualification test. He says, well, I'll cheat. I'll cheat off of you guys. They said, you don't cheat off of one. All right. You sit in the middle. We'll sit around you. But don't cheat off of one of us because they'll figure it out. So cheat off of some of us and get the wrong answers from everybody. So he did that. And when the test was over and so on, they wouldn't let him go until they figured out whether or not they had passed. The non-commissioned officer in charge came over to Ted and laid his hand on his shoulder and said, son, the captain who was running the reception station wants to see you. I'm in big trouble now, he says to himself in Yiddish and/or Hungarian, and he gets dragged off to the captain's office, and the captain who's running the place says, congratulations, you got the highest score ever. I'm not making this up. Ted Rubin went to fight in Korea and was recommended for the Medal of Honor 4 separate times for 4 different actions. And all the paperwork got lost. And the reason it got lost was because his first sergeant told him, after he gave him some impossible mission to be a detachment left in contact or whatever, and managed to come back like a cat that you bring somewhere, and he came back when the first sergeant thought he would die. He said, no expletive Jew will ever get any award in my unit. And all the recommendations that were made by his fellow soldiers for Ted's valor in all these missions were thrown away. Ted eventually was wounded, captured by the Chinese, spent the remainder of the war in a Chinese POW camp, and managed to survive that too. Among the things he did was to sneak out of he was a pretty wily guy. He managed to break out of the camp. This is repeatedly, break out of the camp, but didn't run away. He went to the barracks of the Chinese soldiers, stealing their food and their medicine and working his way back into the camp to share it with his fellow soldiers, time and time again. These guys were probably like my old drill sergeant, trying to figure out what happened to all the food and the medicines. I went to the ceremony, and it was in the East Room of the White House. And among the people there were soldiers who were still surviving and who re-recommended him for the Medal of Honor, which he received. And there was one guy in particular who was in a wheelchair, and I was talking to him. He pointed across the room at Ted, and he said, you see that man? And he's crying his eyes out. You see that man? That man saved my life. We have to keep in mind the indomitable courage of our fellow combatants, of people who put their country far before themselves and their comrades before themselves, and the mission before themselves, we can get a lot accomplished if we think of something other than ourselves. And Ted exemplified that. He was a distillation of the notion that, that Benjamin Franklin wrote about just before the revolution actually broke out. We either hang together or we will surely hang separately. We have to remember that. We have to remember all of this. I'm reminded of an observation by Mark Twain, who was a terrific writer but a lousy businessman. He lost all the money he ever made, but he was a very smart guy. He once wrote that, he said, when I was young, I could remember anything, whether it had happened or not. And now that I'm old, I can only remember the stuff that didn't happen. I mean, I feel his pain now. But it's something to keep in mind, because it becomes very, very easy to remember the stuff that didn't happen, and easier yet to forget the things that did happen. Today is the day that we should commit ourselves to remembering the things that did happen, and furthermore, that we shall never forget them. Thank you.
And I'm pretty sure every Army vet just said, "Ho." Thank you so much, Colonel Jacobs, for sharing your story today of resilience and courage. One more round of applause. This concludes our program for today. Once again, we would like to thank you, the Library of Congress, Veterans History Project, and the Jewish War Veterans for their partnership on our event today. And to all of you who are here, please, we invite you to stay for refreshments and fellowship. To those of you who are online, please come see this stunning building, and we also thank you for joining us today. Please carry today's lessons with you as you speak out against injustice and promote the values of compassion, tolerance, and respect for human dignity. Thank you all.